Hello there, it's Cassie. Welcome back for the second time today. I am over on the Brutus Monroe blog with this card using several new products that they just came out with. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start out by stamping this stamp. This is the stamp of the month. This stamp can only be purchased through a subscription, and honestly, it's so worth the deal. You should jump right on it. So I'm inking that up using some Raven ink from Brutus Monroe a couple different times, and I'm cleaning off my stamp now using the Squeaky Clean. And if you've never used this stuff before, it's pretty awesome. There's the dispenser, and you just pour that Squeaky Clean right in there, and then you just give it a couple of pumps. I use a microfiber cloth, and then I can clean off my stamp super easy, and then it's ready to be put back in the package. But I went ahead and stamped that on some Bristol Smooth cardstock, and I'm going to just heat set that to make sure that it is good and dry before I start using my Arteza Real Brush markers. I am using a water brush, and I'm just picking that color up. I went ahead and put that right down on my glass mat, and then I'm picking that up with the water brush because I found that for me that's one of the easier ways to paint with it, because it gives me a little bit of wiggle room before the paint or the inks dry right on the paper. I know that a lot of people have a lot of luck with putting the marker right down on the paper, but I just don't. I know that it works well. I've seen people do it. I think I just need to practice a whole lot more. I don't think other people are having to practice as much as me, but for whatever reason, I struggle. So this is how I have found that I enjoy using them, and I really like these Arteza water brushes. They are just super fun to use, and they're easy to use, and I like how they have that water brush tip. I'm actually painting with the water brush that came with these Real Brush markers, but I have found that there are actually some others that I like a little bit better. This one works fine, but I do like these other brushes that I will link down below a little bit better. They have a push button, and for somebody who's a little bit heavy-handed like myself, it works out really nicely. So I'm moving on to using some browns, and if you notice, I'm kind of going out to the outside just a little bit further. I plan to die cut this using a circle die, so I don't have to go too far, but I want to make sure that I'm going far enough, and I want that outline on the outside to be really blended out. I want it to really fade out so that it's not super sharp or super contrasted. See, here I'm trying to use the markers, and see, I'm having a heck of a time blending it out. So I went ahead and put that right on my glass mat, and then I was able to salvage what I couldn't figure out there. So I'll just keep putting those markers right there on the glass mat, and I'm adding a darker shade of brown, and and the paper's still a little bit wet, but that was okay. So now I've heat set it. I want to make sure it was good and dry before I run that through my die cutting machine. I ran that through, and I also ran another bigger circle through with the Periwinkle glitter stock. I've pulled out my Blueprint Sketch Distress Oxide ink for a background, and then I'm just ink blending that all over that background. I'm doing this once again on some Bristol Smooth cardstock because it does blend very easily on top of that. And then I'm going to spritz it with some water. I've said before that my water bottle is kind of messed up. I do need to fix that. Somebody gave me a really good idea of soaking it in some vinegar, because I did live in an area where there was very hard water, so that's probably the problem. So now I want smaller water droplets, and so I'll sprinkle the water droplets all over that. So I have those giant water drops in the background that I made a little bit more subtle by putting a second coat of the Distress Oxide on it, and then I have those smaller ones right on top. Now I'm heat setting this because I plan to do some embossing over the top, but I want to make sure that this is completely dry. To test to make sure that that is completely dry and that my embossing powder isn't going to stick where I don't want it to, I've run my magic powder bag all over that background, and then I'm sprinkling the embossing powder on top, and it is not sticking. Now it is some mica powder, but that's not the actual embossing powder, so I'm not worried about that. That embossing powder is a subscription item as well. That is the embossing powder of the month called Blueberry Sparkle, and it is delicious. I love it. I'm also grabbing the stencil of the month, and I'm going to tack down my paper just using some washi tape so that it doesn't move, and then I'll use another piece of washi tape on the top of my stencil, and once again, that's a subscription item. And then I plan to take my embossing ink and just go right over the top of my stencil. So that embossing ink will go right through the stencil onto the background, and you could use a little mini ink blending tool if you wanted to, but it works just fine to do it right over the top of that. Now I chose the Distress Oxide ink of Blueprint Sketch because I thought it was just light enough to go under my Blueberry Sparkle embossing powder. I've sprinkled that all over my background, and then I'm going to heat set this. And then I'll show you in the end just how gorgeous it really, really is. So I do want to show all of the melting process because, I don't know, I could watch this all day, and this powder is gorgeous. I'm just trying to find all kinds of ways to use it. So I'll show you. I'll slow down my camera so you can get a look at just how beautiful that is. And that sparkle in there is stunning. So yeah, I'll have those linked down below as well. I clean up my mess, and then I pull out some lunch bag cardstock from Brutus Monroe, and I put that into my Score Buddy and score that at 5.5 inches to make it a top folding A2 size card. And then I'll take my Distress ink panel, and I will use some liquid glue to adhere this down to the leftmost side of the card. So I have a border just on top, bottom, and the right hand side. I'm going to stick that under a heavy block, and then I'll set that off to the side to dry. And then I will also take that same liquid glue, and I'll adhere my little circle oyster panel to the Periwinkle cardstock, glitter stock. And then once I have that centered, I'm actually going to throw that right underneath that heavy block as well. And then I'll move on to stamping my sentiment while those dry, which is how the shell are ya? If you like puns. I could not get it. And I laugh every time I read it. I don't know if that just tells my maturity or what, but I love it. I trimmed down the one side of my circle because I wanted it to be offset. I'm using my T ruler to make sure that I have my how the shell are ya lined up. And then I'll tack that down with liquid glue. I put some foam tape on the back of my circle, and I'll tack that down, and then I'll trim off the excess of my sentiment panel. I decide to stamp the little oyster shell on the inside using that embossing ink for a watermark effect. And then I grab some glossy accents for my pearl and the little bubbles that are all around the pearl. And so that will finish off this card. So head on over to the blog if you'd like a little bit more information about some of these things or how I did it, and you can see what we've been up to. I'll have everything that I use linked down below. And if you like this video, hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. And as always, thank you so much for stopping by.